My name is Rosie Callahan. I am 34 years old. And the moment I need to tell you about, the one that changed everything, happened on a Tuesday evening in September, while my boyfriend was out on a date with someone else, and I was standing alone in our backyard in the dark, holding a garden spade, looking down at the grass. I want you to sit with that image for a second. A 34-year-old woman, alone in a backyard, spade in hand, the kitchen light spilling out through the window behind her, making a yellow rectangle on the lawn. The dog somewhere near her feet, confused about why his human was out here at 9 o'clock at night, doing what she was doing. I had gone back to him. That's the part I need you to understand before anything else. I had left, and I had packed my things into 4 bin bags and a suitcase with a broken wheel, dragged them down 2 flights of stairs, and driven away from that flat, with my hands shaking, and my jaw set, and my eyes completely dry, because I had promised myself I was done crying over Daniel Marsh. And then, 7 weeks later, I had gone back. I know. Trust me. I know. He had called me on a Wednesday afternoon when I was at work, and his voice sounded like the version of him I fell in love with. Soft, careful, slightly uncertain. The voice he used when he was being real and not performing. He said he'd been going to therapy. He said he understood now what he'd done and why, and that he could see the pattern, and he wanted to break it. He said he missed me every single day. He said, and this is the line that got me, the line I have turned over and over in my hands since. He said, I think I'm finally ready to be the person you deserve. 7 weeks. That's all it took. 7 weeks of distance and 1 phone call, and I was back in his flat, back in his bed, back at his kitchen table eating the pasta he made on Friday nights, back in the life I had physically dragged myself out of, with a broken-wheeled suitcase. And for 6 weeks after that, it was good. Or it seemed good. Or I needed it to be good so badly that I interpreted everything as good. One of those 3. Probably the 3rd. And then, it was a Tuesday in September, and he told me he was going to his friend Marcus's place for the evening, and something in his voice when he said it, something flat and careful and rehearsed, made me go very still on the inside. He left at 7, and by 8:15, I was in the backyard with a spade. Here's what I need you to understand about that moment. I was not just angry. I was something past angry, something that doesn't have a clean name. I was furious at him, yes, at the flatness in his voice, at the text from a number I didn't recognize, that I'd seen the screen light up with an hour before he left, at the way he'd kissed me on the cheek when he walked out the door, like I was furniture. But I was also furious at myself, at the woman who had packed 4 bin bags and driven away with dry eyes and a promise, and then undone all of it for a phone call and a bowl of Friday night pasta. I had believed him. I had looked at his face while he said, I think I'm finally ready, and I had believed every single word. I standing in that backyard with the spade in my hands and the dog weaving around my ankles. I made a decision. Not the obvious one. Not yet. First, I made the petty one. The one that, even now, I cannot fully bring myself to regret. And what I did next is the reason I'm telling you this story. Let me take you back. Not to Daniel. Not yet. Let me take you back to before him, to the life I had that felt like mine, the version of myself I was before I started making myself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of who I should be. I grew up in Coventry, middle child of 3, which means I spent my entire childhood being simultaneously overlooked and over-responsible, which is exactly the personality profile that leads a person toward relationships with men who need fixing. But I didn't know that then. I just thought I was easygoing, knew adaptable, good in a crisis. My mum worked at the council offices, and my dad drove long-haul lorries, which meant he was home 3 days out of 7, and those 3 days had a particular quality. The house louder, the fridge fuller, the evenings longer. I learned early that love could be something that arrived and departed on a schedule, and that you simply arranged yourself around that schedule and called it normal. I moved to Bristol when I was 22, for a job in marketing that turned into a career I was genuinely proud of. By the time I was 30, I was managing a team of 7 people and running campaigns with budgets that would have made my 22-year-old self completely speechless. I had a flat I'd chosen myself. 2nd floor, bay window, and the kind of kitchen that made you want to actually cook, and a group of friends I'd built slowly and carefully over 8 years who knew me well enough to call me out when I was being an idiot. I had a dog named Bernard, a scruffy terrier mix, gray around the muzzle by the time this story happens, with the absolute conviction that every single human he encountered had been placed on Earth specifically for his benefit. He slept on the end of my bed and snored like a retired sailor, and I loved him more than I have ever loved anything without complication. I was, in other words, a person with a functioning life, a real one I had built myself, from nothing, in a city where I'd arrived knowing almost no one. I met Daniel at a work event. Not my work. A colleague's husband's company event, at one of those Friday evening things where there's warm Prosecco, and a room full of people you half know, and everyone's slightly relieved when it's over. He was standing near the window talking to someone I'd never met, and he laughed at something the other person said, and the laugh was real, unguarded, the kind that makes you look across a room. He was 37. He worked in architectural design. He had this quality of complete attention. When he talked to you, he made you feel like you were the most interesting thing in the room. And at 32 years old, I was just self-aware enough to know that was dangerous, and just lonely enough not to care. We swapped numbers. He texted the following morning, not that evening. The morning, which felt considered, which felt like someone who knew what they were doing. It's like we dated for 3 months before I let myself believe it was real. 3 months of dinners and long walks and Saturday mornings, reading different sections of the same newspaper, in companionable quiet. 3 months of him meeting Bernard and Bernard, for the first and only time in his life, being immediately suspicious of a new person, circling, not settling, watching with those small, dark eyes. I should have listened to the dog. I moved into his flat 14 months after we met. I stored most of my furniture because his flat was smaller, which meant I left behind the kitchen table I'd bought at a market in Clifton for £240, a heavy oak thing with 4 mismatched chairs that I'd painted the same shade of green, and I told myself that was fine. That furniture was just furniture, that what mattered was the person. Bernard came with me. Of course, Bernard came with me. Those first months in the flat were good. I want to be honest about that. They were genuinely good. We cooked together on Sunday afternoons. Real cooking, the kind that takes 3 hours and dirties every pan. He knew things about wine that he shared without being insufferable about it. He remembered things I'd mentioned weeks earlier. a book I'd said I wanted to read, a restaurant I'd walked past and pointed at. And they'd appear, quietly, without fanfare, just placed into the life we were building. I thought, this is it. This is the one that works. I was 32 years old, and I thought I had finally figured it out. The first time something felt wrong, I was 33. We'd been living together for 8 months. He came home late on a Thursday, and not dramatically late, 40 minutes maybe. But he'd said he'd be back by 7, and it was nearly 8, and he hadn't texted. When I mentioned it, mildly, not as an accusation, just a simple, "You didn't text," his face did something I hadn't seen before. It closed. Very fast. Like a shutter coming down. He said he'd lost track of time. He said he was sorry. He kissed me on the top of my head and went to change his clothes. And by the time he came back to the kitchen, he was the version of him I knew again. Easy, warm, present. And I decided I'd imagined the shutter. I was very good in those early months at deciding I'd imagined things. The second time was a Saturday morning, when his phone lit up on the counter between us while we were having breakfast, and he picked it up very quickly, faster than you'd pick up a phone you weren't worried about. I saw him glance at the screen, then at me, and his face did nothing, which was its own kind of thing, that careful nothing. And he put it face down and said, "Marketing email," and went back to his toast. I thought, maybe it was a marketing email. I thought, why are you like this? Why does everything feel like evidence? This is a man having breakfast with you, and you're already building a case. I ate my toast. I said nothing. This is how it works, isn't it? You collect these small moments. The late Thursday, the flipped phone, the way he sometimes answered questions about his evening with a level of detail that was just slightly more than the question required. And you file each one away and tell yourself there's an innocent explanation, and the file gets thicker, and you keep telling yourself, and the file gets thicker still. By the time I found the actual evidence, a message on his laptop screen that I wasn't snooping for, that simply appeared while I was passing the desk looking for a charger. The file was so thick I almost wasn't surprised. Almost. The message was from someone named Jade. It was not ambiguous. It required no interpretation. It was the kind of message that exists in only one context, and I stood there in the middle of the room holding the charger I'd come to look for, and I read it once, and then I read it again, and then I just stood very still for about 30 seconds while everything rearranged itself. He was in the shower. I could hear it running. I went and sat on the sofa with Bernard, and I waited. When he came out, I said his name once. He looked at me, and something in my face told him, before I said another word, that the thing he'd been managing and concealing and explaining away was over. I said, "Who is Jade?" And the shutter came down. Before I tell you what happened next, if you want to hear the rest of this, like and subscribe. It only takes a second, and it means everything to me. Drop a comment with your location and your local time. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to that living room, that sofa, that man coming out of the shower into the wreckage of what he'd built. He didn't deny it immediately. That surprised me. I had expected denial, the reflexive, insulted kind, the "how dare you even suggest." But instead, he sat down on the armchair across from me, which was as far from me as the room allowed, and he put his hands on his knees, and he looked at the floor. That look told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been happening. "How long?" I said. He said a number, 4 months, said quietly, into the floor. 4 months. We had been living together for 12 months, which meant that for 1/3 of our entire cohabitation, he had been... I couldn't even find the word. I just sat there with the number 4 months in my head, like a stone. Bernard had come to sit on my feet. He does that when he senses something is wrong. Warm, heavy weight of him across my feet, and I was grateful for it in a way I couldn't have explained. "Is it still happening?" I said. He looked up. "No." "When did it end?" 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. Just 3 weeks ago, I had sat across from him at dinner and talked about whether we should go to Portugal in October, and he had said yes. Let's do that. And he had already ended a 4-month affair 3 weeks prior and said yes. Let's go to Portugal. Like a person with a completely clean conscience. "Why?" I said. And I didn't mean why did you cheat. I meant why did it end? Because I wanted to know if she had ended it, or if he had, and what that said about where I sat in the hierarchy of his choices. He said she had ended it, that she'd wanted more than he was willing to give. So I was the consolation prize. I was what remained when the preferred option walked away. I stood up. Bernard moved off my feet. I walked to the bedroom and I started pulling things out of the wardrobe, and I did not cry. I just pulled clothes out with this mechanical efficiency, this completely still fury. And I found 4 bin bags under the kitchen sink, and I filled them. And I found the suitcase with the broken wheel at the top of the wardrobe, and I filled that too. And by 11 p.m., I was in my car with everything I'd come with, and some things I'd bought since, and I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. I did not cry for 3 days. I went to my friend Priya's flat and slept on her fold-out sofa and ate whatever she put in front of me and stared at the wall and did not cry. On the 4th day, I cried for 6 hours straight. Priya sat with me for all of it and said almost nothing, which was exactly right. And then 7 weeks later, he called me with that voice, that soft, careful, slightly uncertain voice, and I went back. I know. Yes, I know. I know. I know. The 6 weeks after I returned were, as I said, good, or close to good, or the version of good that exists when you're trying very hard, and the other person is also trying, and you've both agreed, silently, not to look too directly at the thing that broke. He was attentive, careful. He came home on time. His phone stayed face up on the counter. He made the Friday night pasta and asked about my week with genuine interest and remembered the details I gave him and asked follow-up questions the following week. I thought, this is what change looks like. This is what therapy does. This is the man who called me with that voice, because he meant it. Bernard remained unconvinced. He still circled Daniel sometimes, still watched him with those small, dark eyes, and I told myself the dog was just adjusting to the return of the routine. I was so desperate to be right about this. And then, it was a Tuesday evening in September, and Daniel said he was going to Marcus's place, and his voice had that quality, flat, careful, rehearsed. And an hour before, he left his phone lit up with a text from a number with no name attached, and he picked it up very fast and put it face down. And I watched his face do nothing, that careful nothing, and I thought, oh, I've been here before. He left at 7. I watched him go from the window. He kissed me on the cheek at the door, which is not how he usually kissed me. And I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the space, and I stood there for probably 5 full minutes after the car had gone. Then I went to the backyard. I picked up the garden spade. I looked at the lawn. Bernard appeared beside me, tail low, watching me with his old gray face. I thought about the oak table I'd left in storage, the 240 pounds, the 4 mismatched chairs I'd painted green. I thought about Portugal, which we'd never booked. I thought about 7 weeks on Priya's fold-out sofa and 6 hours of crying. I thought about 4 bin bags and a suitcase with a broken wheel. I thought about a woman named Jade who had wanted more than he was willing to give. And then I did what I did. I will not spell it out in clinical terms. You already know what I did. I had a spade, a backyard, and a dog. I had a pillow belonging to a man who was out on a date while I stood in our garden in September darkness. It took about 12 minutes. Bernard supervised. I washed my hands very thoroughly. I went inside. As I made a cup of tea, I sat at the kitchen table. His kitchen table, not my oak one, which was still in storage. And I drank it slowly. I felt, for the first time in 7 weeks, completely clear. The night that followed was the longest of my life, and also, in a strange way, the most honest. He came home at 11:43. I know the exact time because I was awake, sitting in the living room with the lamp on and a book I wasn't reading. And I heard his key in the lock, and I looked at my phone. 11:43. He seemed surprised I was still up. He said something about Marcus's, about losing track of time, about 1 more drink turning into 3. His voice had that same flatness it had when he left. I said goodnight and went to bed. I lay in the dark and listened to him move around the flat. Kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and I listened to him get into bed. I listened to the specific sound of him shifting against the pillow, settling, adjusting, and then going still. I stared at the ceiling. I did not laugh. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing triumphant or gleeful about lying there in the dark. What I felt was simpler than that, and sadder. I felt the specific grief of someone who has confirmed what they already knew, and now has to live with having confirmed it. He slept. I lay awake. The clock moved from midnight to 1 to 2. This is the moment I need you to hold still with me for. The flat was dark and quiet. Bernard was at my feet, warm and heavy, and asleep. Daniel was asleep beside me, breathing slowly, having come home from wherever he'd been, and climbed into his bed and gone to sleep, like a man with a clean conscience. And the street outside was silent. Somewhere distant, a car passed. Everything was still. And I was lying in the dark, knowing exactly who I was, exactly what I'd done, and exactly what I was going to do next. If you have ever gone back to someone you absolutely knew you should have stayed away from, if you have ever stood in the rubble of your own good decision and watched yourself undo it, tell me in the comments. How did you handle it? What did you do on the nights when the silence was too loud? I want to know. And if you're still here with me, hit that like button. Because the next part is where everything begins to shift. The morning he discovered it was a Thursday. I was already up, already dressed, already at the kitchen table with coffee, when I heard him, in a sound from the bedroom that I cannot adequately describe. Something between a word and not a word. Something that had no language in it at all. I looked up from my coffee. He appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not confusion. Something more fundamental than either of those. Something that knew, before he had words for it, that a line had been crossed that he didn't know existed. He said my name. I said calmly, "Good morning." He said, What is... I picked up my coffee cup. I said, "I think we both know this isn't working." He stared at me. I said, "I've been on the phone with my friend Priya. She has space for me again. I'm going to start moving my things out this weekend." I paused. I've already called about the bond on a flat in Redland. It's £280 a month more than I wanted to spend, but I think the timing is right. He continued to stare. I said, "I know about last night. I'm not going to pretend I don't. I'm not going to have this conversation again." I put down my coffee cup. "I'm going to take Bernard for his walk now." I stood up. I clipped Bernard's lead to his collar. Bernard, who had been watching the doorway, where Daniel stood with those small, dark eyes, turned and walked with me to the front door without looking back. We were outside in 30 seconds. I did not look back either. The weeks that followed had the quality of a very slow untangling, not dramatic, methodical. I moved my things out over 2 weekends with Priya's van and her boyfriend's back, and a cheerful efficiency that surprised even me. The 4 bin bags had become properly packed boxes this time, labeled, stacked. The suitcase with the broken wheel I left behind deliberately. A small thing, a symbolic thing, a line in the carpet where it used to sit. I collected my oak table from storage, drove it to the new flat in Redland with the help of my colleague James, who is 6'3", and complained about the weight of it with such theatrical suffering that I laughed for the first time in weeks. A real laugh, sudden and unplanned. I painted the 4 chairs again. Not green this time. A deep blue, the color of the Bristol sky on a clear October morning. I set them around the table in the kitchen of the new flat and stood back and looked at them. Mine. Just mine. Priya came over the first Saturday I was properly in and brought wine and a potted plant she said was unkillable, which felt like exactly the right housewarming gift. We sat at the oak table and drank the wine and talked for 4 hours, and Bernard slept under the table on my feet the entire time. Around midnight, Priya said quietly, "How are you, actually?" I thought about it. I said, "I think I'm okay. Like genuinely okay. Not just saying it." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You seem different." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Less careful, like you're not watching yourself anymore." That stayed with me. Less careful, like I wasn't watching myself anymore. I turned it over for days afterward, trying to understand what she'd seen that I hadn't noticed in myself. And what I eventually landed on was this. For the entire duration of my relationship with Daniel, I had been performing a version of myself that was trying to be enough. Trying to be the right amount of everything. Interesting but not demanding. Present but not clingy. Forgiving but not a pushover. Calibrating constantly. Watching myself constantly to make sure the calibration was correct. And now I had stopped. The calibration was off because there was no one to calibrate for. And the thing that looked like not watching myself was actually just being myself, without an audience. 3 months after I moved out, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a Thursday afternoon, 2:17 p.m. I was at my desk at work, halfway through a campaign proposal, and I almost didn't answer. Something made me pick up. It was a woman named Claire. She introduced herself carefully, said she was calling because she'd found my number through a mutual contact, said she wanted to talk to me about Daniel Marsh, said she was sorry if this was out of nowhere. I said, "How do you know, Daniel?" She said, "I was seeing him until about 6 weeks ago." I sat very still at my desk. She said, "I know this is strange. I found out some things afterward, and I thought you should probably know too." What Claire told me in the next 20 minutes, I won't relay in full, because some of it is hers, and not mine to share. But what I will tell you is this. Daniel had not been to therapy. Not once. He had told me he was going to therapy every Tuesday evening. He was not going to therapy on Tuesday evenings. Claire confirmed this in the most direct way possible, which is that she had been the Tuesday evening for 4 of the 6 weeks I was back with him. The therapy had been a lie. The entire architecture of the reconciliation, the growth, the self-awareness, the readiness, the finally understanding had been constructed specifically to get me back into the flat. And it had worked. It had worked completely. Because I had wanted it to work, and because he knew exactly which words to use with a person who had loved him. I thanked Claire for calling. I asked if she was okay. She said she thought she would be. We spoke for another 10 minutes. 2 women sitting in the aftermath of the same person's choices. And there was something in that conversation, something in the shared recognition of it, that felt like the closing of a door. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a moment. Then I opened the campaign proposal and kept working. I didn't cry about it. I want to be honest about that. I had expected to cry when I finally understood the full shape of it, but what I felt instead was something cleaner, a confirmation, a final piece of information clicking into place. I texted Priya, "Call me tonight when you're free. I have a last chapter." She called at 7. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with great feeling, "The dog knew." The dog knew. 6 months after I moved into the flat in Redland, I ran into Daniel at a supermarket. Not planned. Just the specific cruelty of a city that is large enough that you shouldn't keep encountering people, and small enough that you do. He was in the cereal aisle, and I came around the corner with my basket, and we were suddenly 3 feet apart, with nothing between us. He looked. Diminished is the word that comes to mind. Not physically. He was the same. But something in the way he was standing, the way his face arranged itself when he saw me, had a quality of smallness that I hadn't seen before. He said my name. I said hello. He said, "You look well." I said, "I am well." There was a pause. He looked at my basket. Bernard's food, pasta, the expensive olive oil I'd started buying because it was my flat and my money, and I could. He said something about it being good to see me. He said something about hoping things were okay. I looked at him, this man who had built a lie, and walked me into it with a soft, careful voice. This man who had said, "I think I'm finally ready," and meant nothing by it at all. And this man who had climbed into bed on a September night with no idea what he was lying on. I said, "Things are really good, actually. Take care of yourself, Daniel." And I walked to the next aisle. Bernard was in the car park. He was asleep on the back seat when I got back, head on his paws, and he lifted it when I opened the door and looked at me with those small, dark eyes that had never trusted Daniel for a single day. I scratched his ears. I drove home to the flat in Redland with the oak table and the 4 blue chairs. If you liked how this ended, not with a screaming match, not with a breakdown, but with a woman who finally stopped calibrating and just walked to the next aisle, then subscribe and check the description. I have more stories just like this one waiting for you. Now let me tell you the last thing. And here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Going back was not stupidity. I want to say that first, because it's the thing I most needed someone to say to me in those months, and no one quite did. Going back was hope. It was the specific, exhausting, very human hope that the person you chose to love might become, at last, the person you needed them to be. That hope is not a character flaw. It is not weakness. It is one of the most human things there is. But there is a difference between hope and the suspension of what you actually know. I knew, on some level, from the Thursday with the flat phone to the late Tuesday with the rehearsed voice, from Daniel's shutter face to Bernard's circling distrust. I knew. I had a file full of small moments, and I had chosen, repeatedly, to believe the innocent explanation because the alternative was losing something I had built my idea of the future around. And the thing I most want to say to you, the thing I sit at my oak table and think about when I'm being honest with myself, is that the loss of that future wasn't the worst part. The worst part was not trusting myself when I already knew. The worst part was the performance. All that careful calibration, all that watching myself, all that trying to be enough for someone who had decided I was enough only when the alternative walked away. You cannot calibrate your way into being loved correctly. That's the thing. You cannot adjust and accommodate and forgive your way into safety with someone who has decided you are an option rather than a choice. And the only thing you can do, the only move that actually works, is to be so completely, uncomplicatedly yourself that the people who can't handle it leave of their own accord, and the ones who stay are staying for something real. I think about the oak table sometimes. 240 pounds from a market in Clifton. 4 mismatched chairs that I painted green and then blue. A table I put in storage for a man and then collected and brought back to a flat that was mine. It's just a table. It's just wood. But when I sit at it in the morning with my coffee and Bernard asleep under it on my feet, it is the most specific object of freedom I have ever owned. And that, I think, is the whole lesson. Not the revenge. Though I will not pretend the revenge wasn't satisfying, because I would be lying to you. Not the phone call from Claire, and which gave me information I needed. Not even the supermarket aisle, though that was its own quiet completion. The lesson is the table. The lesson is, know what is yours. Know what you put in storage and what you left behind on purpose. Know the difference between the broken-wheeled suitcase you left deliberately and the things worth going back for. Go back for the table. Leave everything else. The dog always knew. Learn to listen to the dog.